The morning mist clung to the plains of Magnesia ad Scipio in the year 190 BC, masking the sheer scale of the conflict about to unfold. King Antiochus III the Great stood amidst his massive army of 70,000 men, a diverse force drawn from the vast reaches of the Seleucid Empire, including scythed chariots and armored elephants. Across the field, the Roman legions formed their disciplined lines, their silence contrasting sharply with the cacophony of the multicultural host facing them. This was not merely a battle for territory, but a collision of two distinct worlds: the rising power of the Roman Republic and the fading glory of the Hellenistic kingdoms established by the successors of Alexander the Great. The air was thick with tension as soldiers on both sides gripped their weapons, knowing that the outcome of this day would reshape the map of the known world forever. The stakes of this confrontation were nothing less than total dominion over the Mediterranean basin and the future of Western civilization. For centuries, the Greek successor states had ruled the East with absolute authority, maintaining a delicate balance of power through dynastic marriages and constant warfare. However, the rapid ascent of Rome following its victory over Carthage had disrupted this equilibrium, causing alarm in the courts of Antioch and Alexandria. If Antiochus could crush the Roman legions here on Asian soil, he would restore the primacy of the Hellenistic monarchs and confine Rome to the Italian peninsula. Conversely, a Roman victory would shatter the myth of Greek invincibility and open the gates of the opulent East to the insatiable ambition of the Senate and people of Rome, marking the beginning of a new imperial era. At the center of this storm stood Antiochus III, a ruler who had earned the epithet the Great through decades of tireless campaigning to restore the boundaries of the Seleucid Empire. He was a man of boundless energy and strategic vision, having marched as far as India to reassert authority over rebellious satrapies. Yet his opponent was not a single king, but the collective will of the Roman Republic personified by the Scipio brothers. Lucius Cornelius Scipio commanded the forces officially, but his brother, the legendary Scipio Africanus, the conqueror of Hannibal, served as his advisor and the true architect of Roman strategy. These two titans represented opposing philosophies of war and governance, setting the stage for a clash that would determine which ideology would guide the future of humanity. As the sun burned off the fog, revealing the glittering armor of the Seleucid phalanx and the crimson tunics of the Roman legionaries, a single question hung heavy over the battlefield. Could the rigid and heavy formation of the Macedonian-style phalanx, which had dominated warfare since the days of Philip II, withstand the flexibility and tactical adaptability of the Roman maniple system? The Seleucid army was a terrifying spectacle of ancient power, boasting war elephants and heavy cavalry clad in steel-scale armor. However, the Romans brought with them a grim determination and a tactical system designed to exploit the very rigidity that made the phalanx so formidable. The answer to this question would not only decide the victor of the day, but would pronounce a verdict on the military evolution of the ancient world. The battle erupted with the thunderous charge of Seleucid chariots, intended to break the Roman lines before the infantry even engaged. But the Romans were prepared, and their light infantry showered the horses, with missiles causing the chariots to panic and turn back into their own lines. In the ensuing chaos, the Roman cavalry led by Eumenes II of Pergamon struck the exposed flank of the Seleucid formation, rolling up the line with devastating efficiency. The reveal was brutal and absolute as the great host of Antiochus collapsed under the disciplined pressure of the legions, resulting in a catastrophic defeat that left 50,000 Seleucid soldiers dead on the field. The immediate aftermath saw Antiochus fleeing to the safety of his capital, forced to accept terms that would strip his empire of its power and prestige. This crushing defeat at Magnesia signaled the beginning of the end for the Hellenistic kingdoms as independent world powers. The subsequent Treaty of Apamea imposed crippling war indemnities and territorial losses that permanently weakened the Seleucid state, leaving it vulnerable to internal rebellion and external predation. Rome had effectively neutralized its last great rival in the Mediterranean, transforming from a regional Italian power into the arbiter of kings and nations. The wars that followed were merely the death throes of a once great order, as the shadow of the Roman eagle spread inexorably across Greece, Asia Minor, and the Levant. The decline of the Hellenistic world had begun, and the age of Rome had truly arrived. To understand how two such mighty powers reached this point of no return, we must look back to the political landscape following the Second Punic War. Rome had just emerged victorious from a desperate struggle against Carthage, leaving it with a veteran army and a deep suspicion of any power that could threaten its security. In the east, Antiochus III had taken advantage of the power vacuum to expand his influence into Thrace and the Hellespont, directly threatening Roman allies in Greece. The ambitious king saw himself as the restorer of the empire of Alexander the Great and believed that Rome was merely a barbarian upstart that had gotten lucky against Carthage. This hubris blinded him to the true nature of the Roman beast, which was now turning its gaze eastward. Adding fuel to the fire was the presence of Hannibal Barca, the great Carthaginian general who had fled to the court of Antiochus after being exiled from his homeland. Hannibal served as a military advisor to the king, warning him constantly about the danger posed by Rome and urging him to invade Italy directly. The mere presence of Hannibal at the Seleucid court sent waves of paranoia through the Roman Senate. For the Romans, the nightmare of the Punic Wars was still fresh, and the thought of their greatest enemy commanding the vast resources of the Seleucid Empire was intolerable. This personal vendetta transformed a geopolitical rivalry into an existential struggle, ensuring that diplomacy would eventually fail. The catalyst for open war came when the Aetolian League, a collection of Greek city-states, felt betrayed by the terms of their alliance with Rome and invited Antiochus to liberate Greece. The Aetolians promised the king that the entire Greek peninsula would rise up in support of him against the Roman oppressors. Believing these exaggerated claims, Antiochus crossed the Aegean Sea with a relatively small expeditionary force, expecting to be hailed as a savior. Instead, he found a Greece that was largely indifferent or hostile to his presence. Most city-states, fearing Roman retribution, remained neutral or reaffirmed their loyalty to Rome, leaving Antiochus isolated and dangerously exposed on the European mainland. Rome responded with characteristic swiftness and overwhelming force, dispatching an army under the consul Manius Acilius Glabrio to drive the invader out of Greece. The legions marched south with a singular purpose: to demonstrate that the Roman Republic was the new guardian of Greek liberty. The conflict quickly centered on the pass of Thermopylae, the legendary site where the Spartans had once held off the Persians. Antiochus hoped to use the narrow terrain to negate the Roman numerical advantage, just as Leonidas had done centuries before. He fortified the pass with earthworks and stationed his phalanx to block the road, believing his position to be impregnable against the Roman assault. However, the Romans were well versed in Greek history and military tactics, and they were not about to repeat the mistakes of the Persians. While the main force launched a frontal assault to pin the Seleucid defenders in place, a detachment led by the stern Marcus Porcius Cato navigated the difficult mountain paths to outflank the position. Under the cover of darkness, Cato and his men scaled the heights of Mount Calidromus, surprising the Aetolian guards stationed there. As dawn broke, the Seleucid army found themselves attacked from both the front and the rear. Panic spread through the ranks as the phalanx crumbled under the pressure, turning the defensive stand into a chaotic rout. Antiochus barely escaped with his life, fleeing back across the Aegean to the safety of Ephesus with only a fraction of his original force. The Battle of Thermopylae was a humiliating setback for the great king, but he believed that the war was far from over. He assumed that the Romans would be content with driving him out of Greece and would not risk crossing into Asia. He began to rebuild his forces and strengthen his navy, confident that the vast distance and the formidable barrier of the sea would protect his heartland. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the Roman psyche, which demanded total submission and the removal of any potential threat. The war now shifted to the seas as Rome sought to secure safe passage for its legions to cross into Asia Minor. The Roman navy, reinforced by ships from their allies in Rhodes and Pergamon, engaged the Seleucid fleets in a series of desperate battles. Despite having the tactical expertise of Hannibal, who commanded a portion of the Seleucid fleet, the king found his naval forces outmatched by the aggressive boarding tactics of the Romans and the superior seamanship of the Rhodians. The decisive naval engagement at Myonnesus saw the destruction of the Seleucid fleet, granting Rome undisputed command of the Aegean Sea and clearing the path for the invasion of Asia. With the sea lanes open, the Roman army, under the command of the Scipio brothers, prepared to cross the Hellespont. This was a momentous occasion, marking the first time a Roman army would set foot on the continent of Asia. The march was a logistical masterpiece, as the legions moved through Thrace and Macedon with the support of Philip V of Macedon, who had decided to align himself with Rome against his former rival Antiochus. The cooperation of Philip ensured that the Romans arrived at the Hellespont well-fed and rested ready to carry the war into the heart of the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus, realizing that his defensive strategy had failed, attempted to open diplomatic channels to negotiate a peace. He offered to withdraw from all territories in Europe and to pay half the cost of the war, hoping to buy off the Romans before they could inflict further damage. But Scipio Africanus replied with terms that were intentionally harsh, demanding that Antiochus surrender all territory west of the Taurus Mountains and pay the full cost of the war. The message was clear: Rome would accept nothing less than the complete dismantling of Seleucid power in the region. Left with no other choice, Antiochus resolved to settle the matter on the battlefield of Magnesia. The defeat at Magnesia was total, and the subsequent Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC codified the New World Order. The terms were draconian even by ancient standards, designed to permanently cripple the Seleucid state. Antiochus was forced to abandon all claims to lands north and west of the Taurus Mountains, effectively losing control of Asia Minor. He was ordered to destroy his war elephants and surrender his navy, keeping only 12 ships for coastal defense. Furthermore, he had to pay an indemnity of 15,000 talents of silver, a staggering sum that would burden the Seleucid treasury for decades to come. Perhaps the most humiliating condition of the treaty was the requirement to send 20 noble hostages to Rome to ensure good behavior. Among these hostages was the king's own son, the future Antiochus IV Epiphanes. These young men were raised in the heart of the Republic, exposed to Roman culture, military discipline, and political maneuvering. This practice of taking royal hostages was a brilliant strategic tool, allowing Rome to influence the succession of foreign kingdoms and ensure that future rulers understood the cost of defying the Senate. The Seleucid prince would spend years in Rome learning to respect and fear the power that had humbled his father. The financial burden of the indemnity forced Antiochus III to resort to desperate measures to raise funds, including the looting of temples within his own domain. In 187 BC, while attempting to plunder a temple of Bel in Elymais, the great king was killed by an angry mob of locals. His death marked a tragic end to a reign that had begun with such promise and ambition. The empire he left behind was a shadow of its former self, stripped of its wealthiest provinces and drowning in debt. His successor, Seleucus IV Philopator, inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse, paralyzed by the fear of provoking Rome. Seleucus IV spent his reign meticulously collecting taxes to pay the Roman indemnity, avoiding any military adventures that might draw the ire of the Senate. However, his reign was cut short by assassination, leading to the rise of his brother Antiochus IV, who had recently been released from his captivity in Rome. Antiochus IV was a dynamic and eccentric ruler who sought to restore the prestige of the Seleucid monarchy. He strengthened the army and embarked on a campaign to unify his diverse subjects through the promotion of Hellenistic culture and religion. This policy, however, would eventually lead to severe internal conflict, particularly in the province of Judea. While Antiochus IV focused on internal consolidation, the geopolitical situation continued to evolve. The Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, the other great Hellenistic power, sensed weakness and attempted to retake Syria, initiating the Sixth Syrian War. Antiochus IV responded with unexpected vigor, crushing the Egyptian army and marching on Alexandria itself. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Seleucid Empire might be on the verge of conquering Egypt and restoring its status as a superpower. But the eyes of Rome were always watching, and the Senate had no intention of allowing a single king to control the wealth of the East. The Roman response to the invasion of Egypt remains one of the most famous incidents in diplomatic history. The Senate dispatched an elderly envoy named Gaius Popilius Linas to confront Antiochus IV outside Alexandria. The meeting took place in the suburb of Eleusis, where where the king greeted the Roman with friendship, expecting a typical diplomatic exchange. Instead, Popilius Linas ignored the pleasantries and abruptly handed the king a decree from the Senate, ordering him to withdraw from Egypt immediately. The bluntness of the demand shocked the king, who asked for time to consult with his advisors before making a decision. In a display of supreme arrogance and authority, Popilius Linas used his walking stick to draw a circle in the sand around the king. He told Antiochus that he must give his answer before he stepped out of that circle. The implication was clear: if he stepped out without agreeing to withdraw, he would be at war with Rome. Antiochus, having lived in Rome and knowing the power of the legions, hesitated only for a moment. He bowed his head and replied that he would do as the Senate commanded. This day of Eleusis in 168 BC marked the definitive end of Hellenistic independence. The humiliation in Egypt shattered the image of Seleucid power and emboldened subject peoples to rebel against the central authority. Among the most significant of these uprisings was the Maccabean revolt in Judea, triggered by the attempts of Antiochus IV to suppress Jewish religious practices. The Jewish rebels led by Judas Maccabeus utilized guerrilla tactics to defeat superior Seleucid forces, eventually winning their independence. This revolt further fragmented the crumbling empire, draining its resources and distracting its armies at a time when unity was desperately needed to survive. Following the death of Antiochus IV, the Seleucid Empire descended into a chaos of dynastic civil wars and usurpers. Rome frequently intervened in these disputes, supporting weaker candidates to ensure that the kingdom remained divided and impotent. The once mighty realm that had stretched from the Aegean to India shrank to a small rump state centered in Syria. The kings who followed were little more than petty warlords fighting over the scraps of a ruined inheritance, while Rome watched from the sidelines, waiting for the right moment to deliver the final blow. That moment finally arrived in 63 BC, with the arrival of the Roman general Pompey the Great. Pompey was in the east to conclude the wars against Mithridates of Pontus and to reorganize the political map of the region. He found the Seleucid state in a condition of pathetic anarchy, with rival claimants squabbling over the throne. Pompey decided that the dynasty had outlived its usefulness and abolished the monarchy, turning Syria into a Roman province. With a stroke of a pen, the Seleucid Empire, which had lasted for nearly 2.5 centuries, ceased to exist. The annexation of Syria completed Rome's domination of the Mediterranean Sea, which they now arrogantly but accurately called Mare Nostrum, or our sea. The vast wealth of the East flowed into the coffers of Rome, funding the construction of grand monuments and fueling the political corruption that would eventually bring down the Republic itself. The Roman expansion east was not just a military conquest, but a cultural absorption. While Rome conquered Greece militarily, Greek culture conquered Rome intellectually, influencing everything from art and philosophy to literature and architecture. The decline of the Hellenistic kingdoms and the rise of Rome fundamentally altered the trajectory of history. The political fragmentation of the East was replaced by the Pax Romana, a period of relative stability and order enforced by the legions. The unification of the Mediterranean world under a single administration facilitated the spread of ideas, trade, and eventually religion. It was the road networks and safe sea lanes established by Rome that would later allow for the rapid dissemination of Christianity throughout the empire. However, the cost of this stability was the loss of political freedom for the ancient city-states and kingdoms. The vibrant and chaotic experimentation of the Hellenistic age was replaced by the rigid hierarchy of Roman rule. The distinct identities of the various Eastern cultures were slowly eroded or assimilated into the overarching Roman identity. The Library of Alexandria, the gymnasiums of Antioch, and the temples of Babylon all eventually came under the stewardship of Roman governors who viewed them primarily as sources of tax revenue or curiosities. The Seleucid-Roman wars serve as a stark reminder of the ruthless nature of geopolitical power shifts. The Seleucids, despite their wealth and military heritage, were unable to adapt to the changing world or to comprehend the singular focus of the Roman state. They clung to outdated tactics and diplomatic norms, while Rome rewrote the rules of engagement. It is a lesson in the dangers of hubris and the necessity of adaptability in the face of a rising challenger. Looking back at the dusty plains of Magnesia, we see more than just a battle, we see the pivoting of an era. The phalanx that had conquered the known world under Alexander was shattered by the gladius and scutum of the Roman citizen soldier. The elephants, those terrors of the ancient battlefield, were driven mad and turned against their masters. It was the triumph of a new system over the old, a harsh and pragmatic efficiency, replacing the ornate and ceremonial warfare of the past. The legacy of this conflict echoes through the centuries in the way we understand empire and hegemony. Rome did not just defeat the Seleucids, they dismantled them systematically, combining military force with economic warfare and diplomatic isolation. This blueprint for dismantling a rival power remains relevant in the study of international relations today. The Romans understood that true victory required not just winning the battle, but destroying the enemy's will and capacity to fight again. As we walk through the ruins of Ephesus or gaze upon the remains of the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek, we are witnessing the physical evidence of this transition. These stones tell the story of a world that was violently reshaped by the ambition of a single city-state on the Tiber River. The ghosts of Antiochus and Scipio still haunt these lands, their conflict, immortalized in the stratigraphy of the earth and the pages of history. Ultimately, the story of Rome's expansion east is a tragedy for the Hellenistic dream of a cosmopolitan world united by Greek culture. That dream was replaced by the reality of Roman law, an order, a system that brought peace, but at the point of a sword. The diverse tapestry of the East was woven into the heavy cloak of the Roman Empire, creating a new synthesis that would define the Western world for the next millennium. As the sun sets on the broken columns of the Seleucid capitals, we are left to ponder the transient nature of power. Empires rise and fall, kingdoms turn to dust, and the greatest of armies are eventually swallowed by the earth. But the ripples caused by the clash of civilizations continue to spread, influencing our laws, our languages, and our very concept of the state. In the end, the whisper of time tells us that no power is eternal. The Seleucids fell to Rome, and Rome in turn fell to its own internal decay and external pressures. But for a few critical decades in the 2nd century BC, the fate of the world hung in the balance on the spear points of the legions and the phalanxes deciding who would be the architects of the future.